The certified letter in my hands was shaking as I read the final ultimatum. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or face immediate legal action for violation of community standards. It was signed by Patricia Donnelly, HOA president, with that smug flourish she used on all her power trip documents. What Patricia didn't know, what none of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association knew, was that they were trying to evict their own landlord. Every single one of their pristine lakefront properties sat on land I owned through my family trust, land my grandfather had purchased in 1952, when this entire area was nothing but fishing cabins and dirt road. But this story starts 6 months earlier, when I made the mistake of thinking I could live quietly among my own tenants. I'd inherited the lake property when my grandfather passed 2 years ago. 43 acres of prime waterfront real estate an hour north of the city, subdivided into 32 lots with a small private cabin tucked away on the original homestead. The HOA had been formed in the 1980s when developers started building expensive homes on the leased lots, but somehow the paperwork had gotten confused over the decades. Most residents assumed they owned their land outright, not realizing they were essentially long-term tenants, paying ground rent disguised as HOA fees. I'd been living in Chicago, working as a corporate lawyer, when the inheritance came through. The lake house represented everything I'd been missing: peace, quiet, a place to write the novel I'd been putting off for years. So I took early retirement, packed up my city life, and moved into the modest 2-bedroom cabin where I'd spent summers as a kid. The property was rustic compared to the McMansions that surrounded it. Cedar shake siding weathered to silver gray, a wraparound porch with fishing nets still hanging from the rafters, and a small dock that had been rebuilt 3 times since my childhood. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear from the corporate world and find some peace. Patricia Donnelly had other plans. I first encountered Patricia at the annual HOA meeting in April. I'd received the notice in my mailbox and figured I should introduce myself to the neighbors, maybe contribute to the community I was now part of. The meeting was held in the community pavilion, a modern structure that definitely hadn't existed during my childhood visits. Patricia commanded the room like a general addressing troops. Perfectly styled blonde hair, crisp white blazer, and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of getting her way. She was in the middle of discussing property maintenance standards when I walked in. "And speaking of maintenance standards," she said, her eyes locking onto me with predatory focus, "we have a new resident who seems unclear about our community expectations." Every head in the room turned to stare at me. I'd worn jeans and a fishing shirt, apparently a fatal error in Patricia's perfectly manicured world. "Patricia Donnelly, HOA president," she announced, striding over with her hand extended like a weapon. "And you must be the gentleman who's moved into the old Henderson place." "Actually, it's the original family property," I said, shaking her hand and immediately regretting the correction. "I'm Michael Henderson, Robert Henderson's grandson." Patricia's smile tightened. "Well, Mr. Henderson, regardless of your family history, you're now part of Lakeshore Estates, which means adhering to our community standards. I trust you'll be making some updates to bring your property in line with neighborhood aesthetics?" I looked around the room at faces ranging from sympathetic to hostile. These people had turned my grandfather's fishing paradise into some kind of suburban perfection contest. "I'm planning to restore it to its original character," I said carefully. "Keep the rustic lake cabin feel." "I see." Patricia's voice could have frozen the lake in July. "We'll need to discuss the specifics. There are standards to maintain." That first meeting should have been my warning. Patricia had built her identity around controlling every aspect of Lakeshore Estates, and my little cabin represented chaos in her perfectly ordered world. The first violation notice arrived a week later. Property maintenance deficiency, failure to maintain lawn according to community standards. Grass exceeds maximum height of 3 inches in multiple areas. I walked outside and measured my grass with a ruler. The longest blade was 3.2 inches. I called the number listed on the notice and reached Patricia directly. "Mrs. Donnelly, I got your notice about grass length. I measured it. We're talking about 2/10 of an inch over your limit." "Mr. Henderson, standards exist for a reason. When we allow one property to slide, it affects everyone's property values. It's a fishing cabin on a lake. It's supposed to look natural. This is Lakeshore Estates, not summer camp. You have 72 hours to correct the violation or face a $200 fine." I hung up and mowed my grass, shaking my head at the absurdity. But this was just Patricia testing the waters. The violations escalated quickly. Week 2 brought a complaint about my dock being structurally inconsistent with community aesthetics. Week 3 targeted my fishing nets as inappropriate decorative elements. Week 4 complained that my cabin's cedar shake siding was deteriorated and unsightly. Each violation came with increasingly aggressive language and higher fines. Patricia was systematically attacking every aspect of my property that made it different from the cookie-cutter lakefront mansions surrounding it. But the real declaration of war came in May. I was sitting on my porch with morning coffee, watching a great blue heron fish in the shallows, when Patricia's black BMW pulled into my driveway. She emerged wearing white capris and a sleeveless top that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, carrying a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Henderson, we need to talk." "Good morning, Patricia. Coffee?" "This isn't a social call." She marched up my porch steps uninvited and thrust a document toward me. "The board has voted unanimously. Your property is in violation of 17 separate community standards. You have 60 days to bring it into compliance or face eviction proceedings." I scanned the list in disbelief. Failure to install decorative landscaping consistent with neighborhood standards. Use of inappropriate building materials for primary structure. Maintenance of dock facilities below community expectations. "Patricia, these aren't violations. These are demands that I tear down my family's cabin and build something that matches your vision." "Exactly. This is an upscale residential community, not a fishing camp. If you can't afford to maintain property appropriate to our standards, perhaps you should consider relocating." The dismissive way she said "relocate" made my blood boil. This was my family's land, my grandfather's legacy, and this woman was talking to me like I was some kind of squatter. "And if I refuse?" Patricia's smile was pure poison. "Then we'll pursue every legal remedy available, including foreclosure on your HOA liens and forced sale of the property." She turned and walked back to her BMW. "You leaving me holding a document that essentially demanded I spend $200,000 renovating my cabin to match her suburban fantasy." That evening, I called my former law partner, James Morrison, who specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. "Mike, they can't force you to rebuild your house to match neighborhood aesthetics," James said, after I read him the violation list. "HOA covenants have limits, especially on existing structures. But can they really start foreclosure proceedings over cosmetic violations? If the fines accumulate high enough and you don't pay them, yes. Some HOAs have broad powers, especially if the original covenants were written aggressively. James, I need you to pull all the property records for Lakeshore Estates. Every deed, every covenant, every agreement going back to the 1950s. "Why? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Patricia picked the wrong cabin to mess with." While James researched the legal history, I spent my days documenting every interaction with the HOA, every violation notice, every threatening phone call. Patricia was building her case for eviction, but she was also building my case for harassment. The violations kept coming throughout June. Unauthorized parking of non-luxury vehicle in driveway, my 10-year-old pickup truck apparently lowered property values. Failure to install appropriate outdoor lighting fixtures. My simple porch light wasn't aesthetically consistent. Improper storage of watercraft. My grandfather's wooden rowboat needed to be replaced with something more upscale. Each violation came with a $200 fine, and Patricia made it clear that failure to pay would result in liens against my property. I was looking at over $3,000 in fines for having the audacity to live in a fishing cabin on a lake. But Patricia's biggest mistake came in early July. I was repairing a loose board on my dock when I heard voices from the water. Patricia was giving what looked like a tour to a well-dressed couple in an expensive pontoon boat. "And that eyesore there is exactly what we're working to eliminate," Patricia said, gesturing toward my cabin. "Once we've completed the eviction process, we'll ensure any new construction meets our community standards." Eviction process. She was already planning my removal and apparently shopping my property to potential buyers. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse to meet with James. He'd spent weeks digging through property records, and the expression on his face told me he'd found something interesting. "Mike, sit down. You're going to want to hear this." James spread out a collection of deeds, surveys, and legal documents across his conference table. "Your grandfather was smart, really smart. When he subdivided the property in the 1960s, he didn't sell the land, he created long-term ground leases. Every house in Lakeshore Estates sits on land owned by the Henderson Family Trust." What does that mean exactly? It means you don't just own your cabin, you own the ground under every house in the development. The HOA fees everyone pays. Those aren't maintenance fees, they're ground rent. You're not a homeowner in the development, Mike. You're the landlord. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. Patricia had been threatening to evict her own landlord. "James, are you telling me I can evict any of them?" "Better than that. As the ground leaseholder, you have final approval over any major property modifications, including forced renovations. The HOA can't make you change your cabin, but you can block their renovations." "What about the violation fines?" James smiled. "Ground leaseholders are typically exempt from HOA assessments. You don't owe them a dime." "And Patricia?" "Patricia's been collecting rent from your tenants and threatening to evict their landlord. That's got to violate a dozen landlord-tenant laws." I sat back in my chair, feeling the first genuine smile I'd had in months spreading across my face. Patricia thought she was dealing with a pushover retiree who would fold under pressure. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who owned the ground she was standing on. The next morning, I called Patricia's number with barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Donnelly, this is Michael Henderson. I've reviewed your violation notices and fines, and I need to inform you that I'm disputing all charges." "Mr. Henderson, you can't simply dispute legitimate violations. The board has photographic evidence of everyone." "Patricia, I've had legal counsel review the HOA covenants and my property rights. As it turns out, I'm exempt from HOA assessments and modifications requirements." "That's ridiculous. Everyone in Lakeshore Estates follows the same rules." "Not everyone, Patricia. Some of us own the land instead of leasing it." There was a long pause. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your house, along with every other house in this development, sits on land owned by my family trust." "You're not my neighbor, Patricia. You're my tenant." The silence stretched for 30 seconds. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice had lost all its commanding authority. That's impossible. I own my property outright." "You own your house, Patricia. But the ground it sits on? That belongs to me. Always has." I hung up and waited for the explosion. It came in the form of Patricia's BMW screaming into my driveway 20 minutes later. She stormed up to my porch, where I was sitting with a cup of coffee and a copy of her ground lease agreement. "This is impossible," she shouted, waving what looked like her property deed. "I paid $800,000 for my house. I own it." "You own the structure, Patricia. But this document says you're leasing the land for $400 a month, with lease renewal subject to landlord approval." Her face went white as she grabbed the lease document from my hands. I watched her read through the terms, seeing her confident worldview collapse in real time. "You can't be serious. This means every violation notice you've sent me is invalid. Every fine you've assessed is illegal. Every threat you've made about eviction is harassment of your landlord." Patricia sank into one of my porch chairs without being invited, staring at the lease document like it might change if she read it hard enough. How did I not know this? Because whoever handled your real estate transaction 30 years ago didn't explain the difference between owning property and leasing it. You've been paying ground rent disguised as HOA fees for 3 decades. But the HOA, we make decisions about property standards, about community improvements. You make decisions about decorating rental property. But I'm the landlord, Patricia. Ultimate authority on property modifications rests with me. I let that sink in for a moment before delivering the knockout punch. And frankly, I'm concerned about the harassment my tenants have been subjecting me to. Might be time to review some lease terms. Patricia's head snapped up. "You can't evict me. I've never missed a payment." "No, but you've been harassing your landlord for months, using your position in the fake HOA to threaten illegal eviction proceedings, and misrepresenting your authority to prospective buyers. Pretty sure those violate the lease terms about peaceful enjoyment of the property." I stood up and walked to my porch railing, looking out over the lake that my family had owned for 70 years. "Here's what's going to happen, Patricia. You're going to rescind every violation notice you've sent me. You're going to refund every illegal fine you've assessed. And you're going to send a letter to every resident explaining that the HOA has no authority over the original Henderson property. And if I refuse, then I'll start non-renewal proceedings on ground leases, starting with yours." Patricia left without another word, but I could see her mind racing as she drove away. She was trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had just blown up in her face. Over the next week, I received visits from half the residents of Lakeshore Estates. Word had spread quickly that their HOA president had been threatening to evict their landlord, and people wanted to know what it meant for their own leases. My neighbor Tom Brennan was the first to stop by. "Mike, is it true that we're all renting the land under our houses?" "Afraid so, Tom. Ground leases, signed by your predecessors. Most people don't realize the difference when they buy. Does that mean you can kick us out?" "Tom, I've got no interest in evicting good tenants. You've been here 15 years. You take care of your property. You've never caused problems. Your lease gets renewed automatically as long as you keep paying rent and don't harass the landlord." Tom laughed nervously. "Patricia's been doing that enough for all of us. What happens to her? That depends on whether Patricia decides to acknowledge reality or keep pretending she's in charge of property she doesn't own." Patricia chose to fight. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Saturday. The community pavilion was packed with residents demanding answers about their property rights and Patricia's authority. I arrived fashionably late, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the kind of confident smile that came from holding all the cards. Patricia had positioned herself at the front of the room behind a folding table covered with papers, trying to project authority she no longer possessed. But I could see the desperation in her eyes as she attempted to control a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from her. "Ladies and gentlemen, We're here to address false claims being made about property ownership in our community, Patricia began. Mr. Henderson has been spreading misinformation about HOA authority and making threats against longtime residents. I stood up from the back of the room. Patricia, would you like me to read your ground lease agreement out loud? Section by section? The room went dead silent. Every head turned to look at me, then back at Patricia, who had gone pale again. I have documentation proving that every property in Lakeshore Estates sits on land owned by the Henderson Family Trust, I continued, opening my briefcase. Ground leases signed between 1965 and 1985, with rental payments made through what you call OA fees. I pulled out a stack of documents and held them up. 32 leases, 32 properties, all owned by the same landlord Patricia, has been harassing for 6 months. The room erupted in confused conversations as neighbors turned to each other with questions and concerns. Patricia banged a gavel on the table, trying to restore order. This is all very interesting, Mr. Henderson, but it doesn't change the fact that community standards must be maintained. Regardless of the technical ownership structure, the HOA has authority too. The HOA has no authority over the landlord's property, Patricia. Zero. None. And harassing your landlord while misrepresenting your authority to other tenants is grounds for lease termination. The magic words, lease termination, silenced the room instantly. Everyone understood what that meant. Tom Brennan raised his hand. Mike, what does this mean for the rest of us? Are our homes safe? Tom, everyone here has been a good tenant. You pay your rent on time. You maintain your properties. You don't cause problems. I have no interest in disrupting that arrangement. I looked directly at Patricia. But some tenants have overstepped their bounds. Some tenants have been pretending to have authority they don't possess, harassing other residents and threatening their landlord with illegal eviction. Patricia finally found her voice. You can't single me out because we had a disagreement about property standards. Patricia, you've sent me 17 violation notices for things like grass length and the color of my porch light. You've assessed over $3,000 in illegal fines. You've threatened foreclosure on property you have no claim to. And last week, I heard you giving prospective buyers a tour, promising them my cabin would be demolished. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Several people were nodding, apparently having witnessed Patricia's tour themselves. You've been acting like you own this entire development, Patricia. But you don't. You're a tenant, just like everyone else. And frankly, you've been a problem tenant. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. I've devoted years of my life to maintaining property values in this community. You've been collecting rent from my tenants and using that money to harass me, I interrupted. That stops now. The meeting dissolved into chaos as residents surrounded me with questions about their leases, their rights, and their future in the development. Patricia packed up her papers in silence and left through the back door. Her reign as neighborhood tyrant officially ended. But Patricia wasn't ready to give up completely. The legal notice arrived Monday morning, Henderson v. Lakeshore Estates, HOA cease and desist harassment of community residents. Patricia had hired a lawyer and was trying to turn the tables, claiming that my revelation about property ownership constituted harassment of HOA members. I called James immediately. She's claiming I'm harassing the residents by telling them they're tenants. Mike, she can't sue you for revealing factual information about property ownership. That's not harassment, that's transparency. What's her angle? Probably trying to muddy the waters, make this look like a dispute between equals instead of what it actually is, a tenant harassing her landlord. How do we shut this down? We file our own suit. Harassment, breach of lease terms, misrepresentation of authority, and interference with property rights. We go nuclear. The lawsuit James filed made Patricia's cease and desist look like a love letter. 23 pages of detailed harassment claims, documented violations of lease terms, and demands for damages including legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive charges for misrepresentation of authority. But the real nuclear option was the lease termination notice. Patricia Donnelly, tenant, at 1247 Lakeshore Drive, is hereby notified that her ground lease agreement is terminated effective 90 days from service of this notice. Cause material breach of lease terms, including harassment of landlord, misrepresentation of authority, and actions detrimental to peaceful enjoyment of the property. I hand-delivered it myself, walking up to Patricia's perfectly manicured front door and ringing the doorbell at exactly 5 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Patricia answered wearing workout clothes, clearly not expecting company. "Michael, what are you doing here?" "Serving notice, Patricia. Your lease is terminated effective November 15th. I handed her the official notice and watched the color drain from her face as she read the legal language. "You can't evict me. I have rights." "You have tenant rights, Patricia, which include 90 days notice of termination for cause. You've had 6 months to stop harassing me, and instead you escalated to filing frivolous lawsuits. This is my home. I've lived here for 8 years. You've rented here for 8 years. Big difference." Patricia's husband Dale appeared behind her, reading the notice over her shoulder. "Patricia, what did you do?" "I maintained community standards. I protected our property values by threatening to evict our landlord." Dale's voice was incredulous. "Patricia, how did you not know we were tenants?" "I left them to work out their domestic issues and walked back to my cabin, where I poured myself a bourbon and sat on my porch to watch the sunset over the lake my grandfather had fished 70 years ago. The next 2 weeks were beautiful to watch unfold." Patricia's lawyer dropped her cease and desist lawsuit after discovering that every claim in my countersuit was documented and provable. The Lakeshore Estates HOA quietly dissolved after residents learned they'd been paying rent, not fees, and had no actual voting rights over community standards. Several neighbors stopped by to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Patricia's increasingly aggressive behavior. Tom Brennan brought over a 6-pack and helped me replace some boards on my dock. "Should have known something was off when Patricia tried to fine the Johnsons for painting their shutters blue instead of white," Tom said. "Nobody should have that much power over other people's homes." "She never had that power, Tom. She just convinced everyone she did." The eviction proceeded smoothly. Patricia and Dale put their house on the market and found a buyer within 3 weeks apparently. Lakefront properties sell quickly even when you're technically selling a house with a 90-day lease termination notice. Patricia made one last attempt to regain control by organizing a petition among the other residents, asking me to reconsider the eviction and establish a new HOA with reasonable leadership. I declined politely but firmly. "Patricia, you had months to back down. You chose to escalate at every opportunity. Actions have consequences." Moving day was set for November 10th. I watched from my porch as the moving trucks loaded up 8 years of Patricia's accumulated attempt to control paradise. Dale waved as they drove away. Patricia kept her eyes straight ahead. The new owners, retired teachers named Susan and Gary Walsh, introduced themselves the following week. They were delighted to learn about the property's history and showed genuine respect for the original cabin that anchored the development. "We love the authentic lake cabin feel," Susan said. "Patricia told us you were planning to tear it down and build something modern." Patricia told a lot of people a lot of things that weren't true. Without Patricia's constant agitation, Lakeshore Estates became the peaceful lakefront community it should have been all along. Residents focused on enjoying their properties instead of policing each other. The fake HOA dissolved entirely, with ground rent payments handled directly through my property management company. I hired a local firm to manage the leases, collect rent, and handle maintenance issues, freeing me to focus on the novel I'd moved here to write. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd retired from corporate law to escape dealing with difficult people, only to discover I was technically running a rental property business. But being a landlord turned out to be much more satisfying than being a corporate lawyer, especially when it came with the authority to evict problem tenants. The lawsuit settlement came through in January. Patricia's insurance covered $15,000 in damages for harassment, legal fees, and punitive charges. Her lawyer included a personal apology letter, acknowledging that his client had overstepped appropriate boundaries and misrepresented her authority within the community. Spring brought new life to the lake. Without Patricia's oppressive property standards, neighbors began personalizing their homes again. Colorful flower gardens replaced mandatory white landscaping. Fishing boats and kayaks appeared at docks previously restricted to appropriate watercraft. I finished my novel in June, a legal thriller about corporate corruption, inspired by my experiences with small-scale tyranny. The advance from my publisher was modest, but the satisfaction of completing a lifelong dream in the cabin where my grandfather had taught me to fish was priceless. The property management company sends me monthly reports on rent collection and lease renewals. Every tenant has renewed their lease without issues, except for the one we evicted for cause. Property values have actually increased since Patricia's departure. Apparently, lack of harassment is attractive to potential buyers. Sometimes I see Patricia's BMW driving slowly past my cabin on the public lake road. She never stops or waves, just slows down as she passes, probably remembering when she thought she had the power to kick me off my own family's land. These days, I spend my mornings writing on the same porch where Patricia delivered her ultimatums, afternoons fishing from the dock she tried to have demolished, and evenings watching sunsets over the lake that has belonged to my family for 3 generations. The great blue heron still fishes in the shallows every morning, completely unbothered by HOA property standards or community aesthetic requirements. My grandfather's wooden rowboat still sits on the shore, weathered and authentic in a way that no amount of Patricia's suburban perfection could improve. And every month, when the rent checks arrive from my 31 remaining tenants, I remember the look on Patricia's face when she realized she'd been threatening to evict her own landlord. Justice served, with a side of property management fees,